because people failed to accept and explore the alternative hypothesis, which turned out to be factually correct.
So we keep on trucking with part 3 of the responses to Salad Fingers here, and on this we'll look at his statements about the mythical mainstream consensus, his belief that psychometric general factor tests, or colloquially IQ tests, are culturally biased. So first, Salad Fingers tries to gaslight the audience by claiming that mainstream research is against Charles Murray. Well, instead of forming a kind of vague gestalt based on the information bubble one happens to be in, why don't we just look at actual surveys of intelligence researchers?
This is the main rhetorical trick of the bell curve. They pretend to concede to mainstream scientific opinion, but then propose a set of conservative and eugenicist political policies as if they hadn't. At the time of the book's release, the backlash against it in certain sections of the media and scientific community was furious. Dozens of articles were written by scientists and journalists attacking the book, studies were conducted to debunk its claims, whole books were written to debunk its claims actually, and these criticisms were often phrased very harshly. Columnist Bob Herbert, writing for the New York Times, described the book as a scabrous piece of racial pornography masquerading as serious scholarship. Mr. Murray can protest all he wants, wrote Herbert. His book is just a genteel way of calling someone the N-word. This controversy ignited by the bell curve has also had quite the lasting impact. When Charles Murray is invited to speak at college campuses, for instance, people turn out in protest, often with angry cries of racist, eugenicist, and so on. And from the enraged reaction to the bell curve, a new reader might expect the book to be blatant and unapologetic racist propaganda, a neo-Nazi screed arguing for the supremacy of the high IQ white race and such things as that. However, when we actually sit down and read the book, things aren't quite that simple. Quoting the back of my copy here, immediately hailed as a masterwork, the ringing answer to those who would classify people, rank them according to their supposed genetic gifts and limits. In this book, Gould is highly critical of everything from phrenology and craniometry to modern IQ testing.
So here's a paper from Rinderman, Becker, and Coyle from February 2020, so it's been accepted and that's when it'll be published. And what they found regarding the black-white IQ gap in particular, the mean response they found from intelligence researchers was that the gap was 49% a result of genetic differences. However, the majority of researchers chose an answer that was 50% or greater, and the median response was 50%. Salad Fingers appears to believe the gap is 0% a function of genes, which I infer from his behavior on every other topic with psychometrics and race. Kind of like how, even though Murray never said that he thought the heritability of the black-white IQ gap was 60%, Salad Fingers inferred from Murray that he thought the gap was 60% a function of genes because of Murray's policy proposals. Well, based on Salad Fingers' emotions and hostility to what Murray is saying, I'm going to presume a 0% heritability estimate on his part. Rinderman, Coyle, and Becker asked the same question back in 2013, and they found similar results, with the mean response being 47% of the black-white gap being a function of genes instead of 49, and the median response being 50. From 1984, Snyderman and Rothman, 1% of the respondents said that the black-white IQ gap was totally a function of genes, which is much lower than it is in later surveys. That 15% was totally a function of environment, while 45% said it was some mix. 14% didn't respond, and 24% said there was insufficient evidence. In 1970, a survey by Robert Friedrichs asked 526 members of the American Psychological Association how much they agreed with this statement. Quote, "It is a not unreasonable hypothesis that genetic factors are strongly implicated in the average Negro-white intelligence difference. The preponderance of the evidence is, in my opinion, less consistent with a strictly environmental hypothesis than with a genetic hypothesis." 38% agreed or tended to agree with the statement, while 50% disagreed or tended to disagree. 30% straight up disagreed, while 10% straight up agreed. So if you want to talk about some consensus against hereditarianism, well, you could say one existed in 1970, but only just. So when Salad Fingers claims the mainstream is on his side, he's engaging in a mixture of dishonesty and ignorance I am going to call disignorance, which is that he's claiming something without researching it, but the reason he's not researching it is because he either straight up doesn't care about the truth, or he is so ideologically blinkered that he doesn't think it's worth looking up. Oh, he's just ignorant about this. He just didn't know. Okay, well, why didn't he know? Because to some degree, you choose what you know. And he chose not to know about this, yet to speak anyway. Now, an addendum here. I realize that those who don't understand this field might imagine that intelligence research, or anything falling under the rubric of psychology, shouldn't be involved with heritability estimates, or that this stuff should be the purview of what you imagine to be geneticists. Now, first off, Just looking at the field of psychology, a lot of people have a bad opinion of that based on what they think of as replication rates. Psychology has a replication rate of around 50%, more like 48%. But compare this to STEM fields, which you might imagine to have a near 100% replication rate, and we can see that psychology is a little bit softer than medicine or engineering, but only by about 7%. Media reports ragging on psychology play into kind of popular ignorance on this. Moreover, psychology is the average of extremely non-rigorous things such as psychiatry, and a field which almost certainly has a higher replication rate than engineering, intelligence research. So basically, intelligence research is probably more of a hard science than engineering if we use replication rate as the criteria. And in terms of statistical power of findings in a field, intelligence research is generally more powerful than fields the layman might consider more scientific. And the reason for this has been attributed to intelligence research being politically opposed, with the result being that intelligence research doesn't get very bold and so focuses more on confirming previous findings and shaving away error than on making new advances. Salad Fingers is just an example of this kind of extreme, irrational opposition to intelligence research. Now, the result of this is that the narrower range of claims that intelligence researchers make are extremely well-founded instead of reaching out to make more claims. The field of behavioral genetics, by the way, falls under psychology. And the way you become an expert on a field or a topic, such as the heritability of intelligence, is not by education background, as leading experts in various fields have completely unrelated educational backgrounds, which sort of calls into question the idea of an educational background in the first place, but that's a topic for another time. That's a whole nother can of worms. You become an expert on something by doing research in that field, and the people actually doing research in the heritability of intelligence are almost all psychologists of some sort. And to demand a kind of molecular genetic standard for this is a deeply unscientific thing. First off, this standard is only ever applied to humans. Nobody was saying we should reserve judgment on whether chimpanzees are less intelligent than humans for genetic or environmental reasons. Before we even knew what a gene was, nobody was saying, oh, you can't assume that the difference in behavior between a human and a rabbit are down to genetics because we don't have the molecular genetic data. It's not in. No, only differences between humans must we have this ridiculous molecular genetic standard, even though the predictive validity of the quantitative genetics is well over 80% within Western nations. But second off, this standard points to a deep ignorance of what science is. If you have a man with a really complex mechanistic theory running on a supercomputer, but he's right 20% of the time versus another man who has some simple statistical prediction rule and a pen and paper, and he's right 80% of the time, the scientific thing to do would be to listen to the man with the pen and paper and some formulas. Which is to say, predictive validity has to be what science is about. Otherwise, what the hell are you doing? You're just going along with the method of explanation that you imagine to be the most sciencey, who has the most beakers, I guess, who has the most complex looking computer formulas running. And keep in mind, bottom-up theories, despite being more sophisticated, which molecular genetics, that would be a bottom-up explanation versus quantitative genetics, which is a top-down. It's a particular versus holistic approach. So particular or bottom-up approaches are routinely less accurate than top-down or holistic theories. For the same reason that it's easier to predict the number of trees in a square mile of forest than in a square meter of forest. So it shouldn't be too difficult to realize why heritability estimates done from, say, twin studies or other kinds of environmental controls, which give you big aggregate estimates of genetic effects relating to a complex trait, even though they can't tell you specifically what genes are doing what, it's not unreasonable to understand why that would be a more accurate predictor of a big complex trait than something that's trying to cobble together an explanation by figuring out what 3.7 million individual SNPs are going to do. And this pattern, which we also saw with his fact-free claim that research on brain size stopped sometime in the 1920s, I suppose, sometime around the period of Cyril Burt, he continues with his bizarre claims on what the experts think about the heritability of racial gaps and what they think about test bias. Now, test bias is another topic where Salad Fingers is radically out of the mainstream. A 2008 paper entitled Survey of Opinions on the Primacy of G and Social Consequences of Ability Testing, a comparison of expert and non-expert views, they detailed the results of researchers Charles Reeve and Jennifer Charles contacting 99 applied psychologists who specialize in intelligence, called the experts, and those who do not, called the non-experts, and asking their views on multiple questions about cognitive ability tests. They found that 73.3% of the quote-unquote experts believed that cognitive ability tests did not have any racial bias, as did 51% of the non-experts, compared to 13.3% of the experts thinking there was bias and 29.2% of the non-experts who believed that the tests were racially biased. And the researchers have good reason to think that the tests are not biased. As far back as 1987, Frank McGurk and Arthur Jensen contacted a bunch of academics who claim IQ tests are culturally biased, and they set up an experiment, described thusly, quote, a panel of 78 judges, including professors of psychology and sociology, educators, professional workers in counseling and guidance, and graduate students in these fields, were asked to classify each of the 226 test items into one of three categories. 1, least cultural, 2, neutral, and 3, most cultural. In the results, they found that the black-white test score difference was significantly larger for the questions that were judged to be the least cultural, and to be the lowest for questions judged to be the most cultural. The question the judges thought were culturally biased had smaller gaps than the questions they judged to be culturally neutral. And if you have any kind of background knowledge of psychometrics, you would predict this, because math, verbal, and information have lower racial gaps than the average for the entirety of traditional full-scale IQ tests.
Now, direct cultural bias in IQ test items is discussed by Hernstein and Murray in Chapter 13. They use an example of a question that includes the word regatta, which is a word that might bias the results towards certain cultural and economic groups. And certain historical so-called intelligence test questions have actually been much worse than this. Some of them amounted to nothing more than general knowledge questions. The Army Alpha test used in World War I asked Army recruits to identify what particular celebrities were famous for, in which cities certain cars were manufactured.
Well, Salad Fingers, have I got news for you. If you want to remove information and math, or maybe even verbal, the racial gaps generally across all the groups, not just blacks and whites, but the racial gaps will get bigger if you remove those kinds of tests. Whereas the more abstract kinds of questions, ones that are more difficult to teach and aren't so much a function of do you know this or not, such as picture completion and spatial rotation, things like that, those have larger racial gaps. Whereas stuff that's just reciting information that you were taught, that has the lowest racial gap. But wait, there's more. The predictive validity of IQ tests for military performance, for job performance, both objective and subjective measures of job performance, and college grades are the same across racial groups. Now, it's possible that the military, universities, and the average of all employee performance evaluators, that they are all equally as biased as the IQ tests are, and they are equally biased with each other. What a coincidence that would be, because Salad Fingers and people like him, they like to flippantly just sort of say, well, society is racist, and IQ tests are racist, and just a product of this racist society. Therefore, scoring lower on IQ test groups, they will do worse in society, not because IQ is predicting anything, but because both the IQ tests and the society that it was made in are racist. But no, what you would have to be saying, Salad Fingers and co., would be far more profound than that. You would have to be saying that these institutions are all almost identically biased against these groups to virtually the same degree. Okay, so it's much more profound and unlikely than what you're actually saying. And finally, the rank order difficulty is the same across races, meaning that the kinds of questions that white people find hard are almost exactly the same as the kinds of questions that black people, Amerindians, Hispanic people, East Asians find difficult. And the correlations between groups for rank order difficulty run anywhere from 0.94 to 0.99. In fact, the biggest race difference in rank order difficulty is between East Asians and everyone else. So that's part 3 on how Salad Fingers is an ignorant liar, a mixture of dishonesty and ignorance. Disignorance.